It's those fine, upstanding lunatics over at Stand to Reason, which one of my viewers pointed out really means that their ideas don't stand up to reason. This time, Greg Koki is going to tell us that God is a moral monster. Oh wait, he's not going to tell us that. He's just going to make excuses that make no sense at all for why these people live in 1984. Slavery is freedom, and ignorance is strength. Let's watch him try to rationalize his way through the stupidity Olympics as he wonders if we're morally free.
You may be wondering, since we are fallen from birth, morally fallen.
Well, that's your assertion at least, but since I don't share your delusion, why would I think that? Outside of your silly fantasy book, why would I think that humanity is fallen at all, much less than from birth? That's not a good way to start, Greg.
Do we really have moral freedom, if that's the case?
You haven't shown that to be the case. You just claim that it is. Yeah, I know he's talking to the mindless sheep that will gobble up whatever crap he's slinging, and not skeptics like me who are going to question his base assumptions. But still, does he have to be so bloody blatant about it?
And this depends entirely on what you mean by moral freedom. And in a lot of these challenges, definitions are critical, okay? So there's two concepts of moral freedom that we might work with here. And one of the concepts of freedom is just the idea that you can do one thing, but you could have done something else if you wanted to.
Well, isn't that the definition of freedom? That you can choose from a variety of options without being unduly influenced or have undue consequences for your choices? Seems to be the only meaning of moral freedom that makes any sense at all.
In other words, you have the ability to do something else. Philosophers call this the CDO condition, could have done otherwise, okay?
For the sake of argument, I'll buy that. Of course, I have a feeling that what comes next is going to be an attempt to redefine terms so that it works out better for the religious. Let's watch.
Now, when it comes to our moral behavior, it seems like in most cases, when we do something bad, we could have done otherwise. We could have done the right thing. And this is why we punish criminals and why we spank our kids, because they could have done otherwise, and they should have done otherwise, and so their punishment or discipline or direction is appropriate, okay? So we do have freedom in that sense, although it is not the case that in every circumstance we are able or going to, maybe that's a better way of putting it, we are going to choose the good.
And there he goes making excuses. Because it isn't enough to say that people have a choice. He has to explain why the choices people make aren't really their fault, because otherwise his followers might just feel bad. So he makes up a reason why nothing bad that ever happens to them is actually their fault, and then he tries to sell them a cure to a non-existent problem that's quick and easy and ignores the real issue.
And it's not because of kind of native physical inability, but it's because our wills are tainted by the fall. We will not do good. We consistently choose the bad.
But if the fall means that we will do no good, and that's not cannot, that's will not, then how are we responsible for anything? We had no choice at all in the matter. Nothing that we do wrong is really our fault. The devil made us do it. The sins of the fathers are visited on the children. We couldn't have done the right thing if we had wanted to. What a way to deny basic responsibility.
So we have here a doctrine of moral freedom that makes us responsible because we could have done otherwise, yet at the same time we will not in many cases, which makes us responsible for our sins. Now there's another sense of moral freedom that I think it's important to keep in mind, because when you think about the could have done otherwise moral requirement, it doesn't seem like God satisfies that requirement, because God is perfectly good, isn't he?
Not if you actually read the Old Testament. Your God is a douchebag. He's mass murdered millions, thrown immature temper tantrums. Hell, he screwed all of humanity over by not giving Adam and Eve any moral agency, and then he held them accountable for doing things that they couldn't possibly known were wrong in the first place. And if that's all good, I doubt your moral sensibilities.
And he can't sin. It is not in his nature to sin.
Only because you made up his nature out of whole cloth. God can't sin because by your own definitions, anything God does is good, even if God does things that, if a human did them, would be sinful. God, that's mighty convenient, isn't it?
He can do whatever he wants, and everything he wants to do is good. Okay?
See what I mean? And Greg can't even see the blatant hypocrisy in what he's saying. But that's not a surprise, is it?
So God doesn't satisfy that requirement. He does not have that kind of moral freedom.
So what you're really saying here is your all-powerful God has no moral freedom. Maybe you've got a different definition of all-powerful than I do.
It seems to me he has a different kind of moral freedom. He has the freedom that is the ability to always do what's right.
Which makes absolutely no sense at all. Now, this is stupid on two fronts. First off, if you can only do what's right, that's not freedom, that's slavery. That's like saying that slaves only have the freedom to serve their masters. They don't have the freedom to, go free. That's not freedom. And the other side here is that Christians simply define anything that God does, no matter what God does, as good. So when God's out there mass murdering people in a worldwide flood, that's a good thing. Why? Because God did it. God could be ripping the heads off kittens, and that would be good according to the absurdly religious. If there's no definition of good external to God upon which we can judge God's actions, then good has no meaning whatsoever.
The ability to always do what's right, one might argue, is a superior kind of freedom. Okay?
No one with a brain in their heads. Okay.
Because it is the freedom from sinning. That's the kind of freedom that God seems to have.
Well, since you're defining sin as doing anything that God doesn't approve of, that's a really stupid definition to begin with. Because obviously, anything that God does, God approves of because he does it. It's like saying that Hitler gets to define bad, therefore the Holocaust wasn't bad because Hitler approved of it. Are you really that dumb?
He can do good. He always does good. He can never sin. That's a good thing.
No, it isn't that he can do good. It's that he must do good by definition. That anything he does is automatically good because he did it. And of course, it's only good for him because if humans try to do a lot of the things that God did in the Old Testament, they'd be violating the Ten Commandments, wouldn't they? But the rules apparently don't apply to God.
And in my view, at least, that's the kind of moral freedom we'll have when we get into heaven. When we see him, we shall be like him because we will see him as he is. And frankly, that's the kind of moral freedom I want.
In other words, you want to be a slave. You want no choices. You want to be forced to act as this tyrant God of yours commands. And Christians wonder why the rest of us think they're such idiots.
I don't want this kind of moral freedom when I could have done otherwise. I could sin. I want to be done with that.
Then that's not freedom. You have no idea what words mean, Greg.
I want to have the freedom that reflects a change in my nature that allows me to always do what's right. And in that sense, because of God, we will be like God.
A moral monster that doesn't follow his own rules and that automatically gets a pass no matter what he does because his followers are morons. And you want us to take you seriously? Yeah, I don't think so. Seriously, how can these people think anyone is going to look at them as anything more than idiots? Because they're spending so much time making mindless declarations that make no sense at all in reality, that no one with more than a handful of brain cells to rub together would buy into anything that they say. And then they pretend that non-believers are immoral. Are you kidding me? Right. We can look at cults out there where the leader is always right, no matter what they do, where the followers are enslaved and forced to do whatever the leader says on threat of punishment, and it's hard not to figure out where these cult leaders came up with the idea. The Bible is a guidebook to abusive relationships. It spells out exactly how to force your followers into insane doublethink that lets you get away with literal murder while being heralded as perfect. And people like Greg here lap it up and pass it on. They're too blinded by their faith to realize just how crazy it all sounds. This is just theological Helsinki syndrome. All of the religious hoops he has to leap through just makes my brain hurt. I'm going to go lay down now.
Everything changes.